Tom found her curled in the snow at dawn, a starving bobcat using her dying body to keep 6 tiny kittens warm through the blizzard. The mother hadn't moved all night, wouldn't move now, and he realized with horror that she'd chosen to freeze rather than abandon her babies. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The wind screamed across the open fields of northern Wyoming with a fury that seemed almost personal, driving sheets of snow sideways and reducing visibility to mere feet. It was the kind of blizzard that made even the most experienced ranchers think twice about venturing outside, the kind that could kill an unprepared traveler in hours. The temperature had plummeted to -15 degrees, and with the wind chill, it felt closer to -40. This was winter at its most unforgiving, a frozen wasteland where survival itself became an act of defiance against nature's cruelest intentions. Tom Brennan had seen his share of harsh winters in his 53 years working the family ranch, but this one was testing even his weathered resolve. The ranch had been in his family for 4 generations, a sprawling 2,000 acres of grazing land and forest that bordered the Bighorn National Forest. Tonight, as the blizzard howled outside the sturdy log walls of his farmhouse, he stood at the window nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, watching the snow pile up against the barn and wondering if his cattle would make it through till morning. He'd done everything he could to prepare, moving the herd to the sheltered south pasture and ensuring they had access to the reinforced windbreaks he'd built years ago for nights exactly like this. His wife Martha had already gone to bed, exhausted from helping him prepare for the storm, but sleep eluded Tom. Something about this blizzard felt different, heavier somehow, as if the weight of the winter itself pressed down on the land. He thought about the wildlife out there in the darkness, the deer and elk that would be huddled in whatever shelter they could find. The smaller creatures burrowed deep into the earth or the hollow spaces of trees. Nature had equipped them for survival, he knew. But on nights like this, even the most adapted animals faced a brutal test. What Tom didn't know, couldn't have known as he stood at that window, was that less than half a mile from his warm house, a desperate drama was unfolding that would challenge everything he thought he understood about the wild animals he'd lived alongside his entire life. In a small depression beneath an overhanging rock formation, partially sheltered from the worst of the wind but still exposed to the killing cold, a female bobcat was fighting the battle of her life. She was starving, her ribs visible beneath her thick winter coat, her body depleted from the demands of late pregnancy and the increasingly desperate search for food in a landscape that had offered precious little for weeks. The bobcat, whom wildlife biologists would later estimate to be about 4 years old, had been on her own for the past month after her usual hunting territory had been disrupted by a massive wildfire the previous autumn. The fire had driven away much of the prey population, forcing predators into unfamiliar territories and creating competition for the limited resources that remained. She'd been pregnant when the disruption occurred, and her condition had made it increasingly difficult to hunt successfully. Rabbits that would normally have been easy prey could outmaneuver her swollen body, and the energy expenditure of failed hunts was taking its toll. But it wasn't her own survival that drove her now. Hours earlier, as the storm had gathered its strength, she'd given birth to 6 tiny kittens in the meager shelter of the rock outcropping. The birth had been difficult, draining what little energy reserve she had left, but her maternal instincts had immediately taken over. The kittens were impossibly small and vulnerable, their eyes sealed shut, their bodies barely able to generate heat. They mewed weakly, instinctively seeking the warmth of their mother's body and the milk that would give them their first nourishment and their only chance at survival. The bobcat curled her body around them, creating a living shield against the wind and cold that sought to steal their fragile new lives. Snow accumulated on her back and head, but she didn't move to shake it off. Every muscle in her exhausted body was focused on a single purpose: keeping her babies warm. Her own stomach cramped with hunger, her body desperately needing nutrients to produce the milk her kittens required, but there was no question of leaving them to hunt. In this cold, separated from her body heat even briefly, they would freeze within minutes. As the hours dragged on and the storm intensified, the bobcat's situation became increasingly dire. Her body temperature was dropping despite her best efforts, and she could feel her strength ebbing away. The kittens, pressed against her belly and chest, were surviving because she was pouring every last bit of her body's resources into keeping them alive. But it was a losing battle against the mathematics of thermodynamics. Heat was bleeding away into the frozen air faster than she could generate it, and her starved body had precious little fuel to burn. The snow continued to fall, building up around the small family until they were partially buried, which actually helped create a small pocket of relatively warmer air. The bobcat's breathing had grown shallow, her movements minimal, but still she maintained her protective curl around the kittens. Somewhere in her depleted mind, maternal instinct burned with a fierce light that refused to be extinguished even as her body began to fail. She would not abandon them. She would not move. She would hold on through the darkness and the cold, hold on until the storm passed or until she couldn't hold on any longer. Above them, the stars were invisible behind the churning clouds, and the moon offered no light to pierce the blizzard's veil. It was the darkest kind of night, when the world seemed reduced to wind and snow and cold, when survival became the only thing that mattered. And in that small shelter beneath the rock, a mother's love was the only thing standing between 6 helpless lives and the frozen oblivion that surrounded them on all sides. The first hints of dawn came reluctantly, as if the sun itself was hesitant to face what the night had wrought. The blizzard had finally begun to exhaust itself around 4 in the morning, the wind dropping from its howling fury to intermittent gusts that still carried stinging pellets of snow. By 5:30, when Tom Brennan's alarm clock shattered the silence of the farmhouse bedroom, the storm had reduced to occasional flurries drifting down from a sky that was slowly transforming from black to a pale, washed-out gray. Tom dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, pulling on thermal underwear, heavy work pants, 2 layers of flannel shirts, and his insulated coveralls. Martha stirred as he moved around the room, her voice thick with sleep, asking if the storm had passed. He confirmed it had mostly blown through, kissing her forehead before heading downstairs to pull on his boots and heavy winter coat. The thermometer outside the kitchen window read -12 degrees, a slight improvement from the night's nadir, but still cold enough to be dangerous for any prolonged exposure. His first priority was checking on the cattle. Tom fired up his Ford pickup truck, waiting impatiently for the engine to warm enough to generate heat, then began the slow journey across his property toward the south pasture. The snow had drifted in spectacular formations, some places nearly bare where the wind had scoured the ground clean, others with drifts reaching 4 or 5 feet high. His truck's heavy-duty tires churned through the accumulation, and more than once he had to back up and find an alternate route around particularly deep sections. The cattle were huddled together in the lee of the windbreak, their breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air. Tom counted them carefully, his practiced eye noting that all 43 head had survived the night. They looked cold and miserable but alive, which was what mattered. He broke open several bales of hay, scattering them for the animals to eat, and used an axe to break through the ice that had formed on their water trough despite the heating element he'd installed. The physical labor warmed his body, though his face remained numb from the cold, his beard collecting frost from his own breath. With the immediate needs of his livestock addressed, Tom allowed himself a moment to simply stand and take in the transformed landscape. The storm had created a world of pristine white, the familiar contours of his land altered by the snow's sculpting hand. In the growing light, he could see the dark line of the forest boundary about half a mile distant. And it was there that something caught his attention. A small shape, darker than the surrounding snow, visible against the base of what he recognized as the old rock outcropping near the property line. His first thought was that it might be a fallen tree branch, weighted down by snow. But something about the shape seemed wrong for that. It was too compact, too rounded. Maybe a deer that hadn't survived the night, he thought with a pang of sympathy. He'd seen it before during particularly harsh winters, animals succumbing to the cold or starvation. If that was the case, he'd need to deal with the carcass before predators were drawn too close to his property. Tom climbed back into his truck and carefully navigated toward the outcropping. As he drew closer, his curiosity deepened into concern. The shape definitely wasn't a branch, and it was larger than he'd initially thought. He parked about 30 yards away, not wanting to risk getting stuck in a hidden drift, and grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight from the glove compartment. The sun was rising now, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and orange, but the light was still dim enough that the flashlight's beam was necessary for detail. He approached on foot, his boots crunching loudly in the frozen snow. 20 feet away, he stopped abruptly, his breath catching in his throat. It was a bobcat. That much was immediately clear from the distinctive spotted coat and tufted ears. The animal was curled in a tight ball, almost completely covered in snow, only portions of its back and head visible. Tom's first instinct was to back away. Even an injured or dying wild predator could be dangerous, and he'd learned long ago to respect the distance between humans and wildlife. But something held him there, rooted to the spot. The bobcat wasn't moving, but he couldn't tell if it was dead or merely unconscious. Then he saw it, a tiny movement that was almost imperceptible. One of the animal's ears twitched slightly, and Tom realized with a shock that the bobcat was alive. Barely, but alive. His mind raced through his options. He should probably call Fish and Wildlife, let the professionals handle it. But out here, it would take them hours to arrive, and he wasn't sure the animal had hours left. Tom took a cautious step closer, then another, watching for any sign of aggressive reaction. The bobcat's eyes remained closed, its breathing so shallow he could barely detect it. The snow had built up around it like a tomb, and he realized that if he'd arrived even an hour or two later, the animal would have been completely buried and invisible. As he circled slowly around the outcropping, trying to assess the situation from different angles, he noticed something that made him stop completely. There was movement at the bobcat's belly, small, barely visible movements beneath the protective curl of her body. Tom's experienced rancher's instincts immediately understood what he was seeing. This wasn't just a dying animal. This was a mother protecting her young. The realization hit him with unexpected force, and in that moment, something shifted in Tom Brennan's practical, unsentimental approach to wildlife. Tom stood frozen in the snow, his mind racing through a calculation that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the fundamental instinct that connected all parents, human or animal. He'd raised 3 children with Martha, had helped birth countless calves and foals over the decades, and he recognized the primal bond he was witnessing. This mother had chosen to die rather than abandon her babies, had spent the entire night shielding them with her own failing body against cold that would have killed them in minutes. He pulled out his cell phone with numb fingers, surprised to see he had 2 bars of signal. His first call was to Martha, his words coming out in a rush as he tried to explain what he'd found. His wife's response was immediate and characteristically practical. She told him to get back to the barn immediately, that she'd prepare a space in the mudroom where they could bring the animals if he could safely transport them. She'd also call their daughter Emily, who worked as a veterinary technician in Sheridan, and might have contacts who could help. His second call was to Ben Crawford, his nearest neighbor and a man who'd dealt with wildlife emergencies before. Ben answered on the 3rd ring, his voice gravelly with sleep, until Tom explained the situation. Within minutes, Ben was promising to head over with his ATV and some equipment that might help. Tom's 3rd call was to the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, though he suspected their response time would be measured in hours rather than minutes given the road conditions in the early hour. While he waited for Ben to arrive, Tom returned to his truck and retrieved several items he thought might be useful. He had a large canvas tarp, some rope, a thick moving blanket he kept for protecting furniture, and an emergency kit that included heat packs designed for treating hypothermia. He also grabbed an old wool army blanket that had belonged to his father, thinking its weight and warmth might be crucial. Approaching the Bobcat again, Tom moved with exaggerated slowness, speaking in a low, steady voice even though he doubted the animal could hear him. The murmur of human speech was more for his own benefit, a way of processing the extraordinary situation he found himself in. He knelt about 6 feet away, close enough to see details but far enough to retreat if the Bobcat showed any sign of aggression. In the strengthening daylight, he could see just how desperate the animal's condition was. Her ribs were starkly visible beneath her fur, and patches of her coat looked matted and dull. Snow had frozen to her whiskers and the fur around her face, and her ears showed signs of frostbite at their tips. But what struck him most was the unwavering determination in the way she maintained her protective curl. Even in what must be near unconsciousness, her body remained locked in that life-preserving position around her kittens. Tom activated 2 of the heat packs, shaking them vigorously until they began to warm, then carefully tossed them to land near but not touching the Bobcat. He didn't dare get closer while she was still conscious enough to potentially react. The heat packs would provide some ambient warmth, he reasoned, without requiring him to risk injury or further stressing the animal. He spread the wool blanket on the snow near the Bobcat, preparing for the moment when he might need to move quickly. The sound of Ben's ATV engine cut through the morning stillness about 20 minutes later. Ben Crawford was a lean man in his 60s, weathered and practical, with the kind of steady competence that came from a lifetime of dealing with emergencies, both animal and human. He parked his ATV near Tom's truck and trudged through the snow, carrying a large animal carrier and what looked like a catch pole, though Tom hoped they wouldn't need to use it. The 2 men conferred in low voices, Ben's experienced eye taking in the situation quickly. He'd worked as a ranch hand for most of his life before buying his own small property, and he'd dealt with everything from aggressive bulls to injured wildlife. His assessment was blunt. The Bobcat was in critical condition, and the kittens wouldn't survive much longer without intervention, regardless of what happened to their mother. They had maybe a window of an hour, possibly less, to get them all to warmth and medical attention. Ben suggested they try to move the entire family together if possible, minimizing the trauma of separation. He'd brought several large towels that could be used to handle the Bobcat without direct contact, reducing the risk of bites or scratches. The 2 men approached together, their movements coordinated from years of working livestock in tandem. Tom carried the wool blanket while Ben had the towels ready. As they drew within a few feet, the Bobcat's eyes opened slightly. They were unfocused, glazed with exhaustion and hypothermia. But there was still awareness there. A weak hiss escaped her throat, more reflex than real threat, and Tom felt his heart contract at the sound. She was still trying to protect her babies even now, with the last reserves of her strength failing. Ben spoke softly, his voice carrying decades of experience gentling frightened animals. He explained to Tom that they needed to be quick but careful, that any sudden movement could trigger a panic response that would waste the Bobcat's remaining energy. They would wrap her and the kittens together in the blanket, creating a bundle that could be transferred to the carrier without separating the family. It was risky, but it was their best option. Tom positioned himself on one side while Ben took the other. On Ben's count of 3, they moved together, sliding the wool blanket underneath the curled Bobcat with smooth, practiced movements. The animal tensed and tried to resist, but her body wouldn't obey the commands of her will. Within seconds, they had her and the kittens bundled together, the blanket providing both containment and additional warmth. Tom could feel the tiny movements of the kittens through the fabric, could hear their weak mewing sounds, and the reality of what they were trying to save, became even more immediate. They moved quickly now, efficiency born of urgency. The bundle was transferred to the large animal carrier that Ben had brought, and additional towels were packed around it for insulation. Tom grabbed the heat packs and placed them strategically around the outside of the bundle, being careful not to make direct contact that might burn sensitive skin. Ben secured the carrier on his ATV, while Tom gathered his equipment and headed for his truck. The journey back to the farmhouse took less than 10 minutes, but felt like an eternity. Tom kept his eyes on Ben's ATV ahead of him, willing the precious cargo to hold on just a little longer. Martha had the mudroom prepared exactly as promised, with heat lamps set up and towels laid out. She'd also pulled out their old pet heating pad and filled several hot water bottles, creating a makeshift intensive care unit that would have to serve until professional help arrived. When they carried the carrier inside and carefully unwrapped the blanket, the full extent of the situation became clear. 6 tiny kittens, their eyes still sealed shut, lay against their mother's belly. They were a mix of colors, some showing the distinctive spotted pattern of bobcats while others appeared to have different markings, and Tom realized with surprise that this might not be a purebred litter. The mother bobcat herself was barely conscious, her breathing shallow and irregular, her body temperature dangerously low. Martha Brennan had seen many things in her 50 years as a rancher's wife, but the sight of the starving bobcat and her tiny kittens stirred something deep in her chest that made her eyes burn with unexpected tears. She blinked them away quickly, her practical nature reasserting itself as she moved into action. Years of helping Tom with difficult animal births and emergencies had taught her to compartmentalize emotion in favor of efficiency, but she made a mental note of the feeling, knowing she'd process it later when the immediate crisis had passed. Emily arrived within 30 minutes of Martha's call, her compact SUV sliding slightly as she pulled into the driveway with more speed than caution. At 26, she'd inherited her father's love of animals and her mother's practical competence, combining both into a career that brought her into contact with everything from pampered house cats to injured wildlife. She burst through the mudroom door, carrying a large veterinary kit. Her blonde hair still uncombed from sleep, but her eyes sharp and focused. One look at the bobcat told Emily everything she needed to know about the severity of the situation. She'd worked enough emergency cases to recognize critical hypothermia and advanced starvation when she saw it. The fact that the animal was still alive at all spoke to an extraordinary will to survive, but will alone wouldn't be enough to pull her back from the edge. Emily immediately began checking vital signs, her hands gentle but efficient as she worked around the protective mother's instinctive tension. The bobcat's temperature registered at 92 degrees, a full 7 degrees below normal for her species, and dangerously close to the point where organ failure would begin. Her heart rate was slow and irregular, her respiration shallow. Emily calculated dosages in her head, weighing the risks of intervention against the certainty of death without it. She'd brought fluid bags, medications for hypothermia, and emergency nutrition supplements, but administering them to a wild animal required careful consideration and steady hands. Ben had stepped back to give Emily room to work, but he remained nearby, ready to assist if needed. Tom stood by Martha, one arm around his wife's shoulders, both of them watching with the intensity of people who understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. The heat lamps Martha had set up were already making a difference, the ambient temperature in the small space climbing steadily, but Emily knew that warming had to happen gradually to avoid shock. First priority was getting fluids into the mother bobcat. Emily prepared a subcutaneous injection of warmed saline solution, explaining as she worked that this would help combat dehydration and support circulation without the risk of trying to place an intravenous line in a semi-conscious wild animal. Her voice was calm and professional, the teaching tone she'd developed from countless hours explaining procedures to worried pet owners. But there was an underlying current of urgency that everyone in the room could hear. The kittens presented their own set of challenges. Emily examined each one carefully, noting that while they appeared to have survived the night better than their mother, they were showing signs of hypothermia and inadequate nursing. Their tiny bodies were cool to the touch, their mewing weak and irregular. Without their mother's milk, and given her current conditions' impact on milk production, they would need supplemental feeding soon, or face their own critical situation within hours. Martha had already anticipated this need, having called their local feed store as soon as Emily arrived. The owner, a longtime friend, had opened early and was preparing kitten milk replacer, along with specialized feeding bottles designed for wildlife rehabilitation. He'd promised to have everything delivered within the hour, along with detailed instructions he'd printed from a wildlife rehabilitation website. The interconnected nature of their rural community, where everyone knew everyone and favors were freely given in times of need, was proving invaluable. Emily's phone rang, and she answered on speaker while continuing to monitor the bobcat's vital signs. It was Dr. Michael Chen, the veterinarian she worked for, and a man with extensive experience in wildlife medicine. She'd texted him photos and vitals as soon as she'd arrived, and he'd been researching protocols while driving toward the Brennan Ranch from his clinic in Sheridan. His voice filled the mudroom, calm and authoritative, as he confirmed Emily's treatment plan and added several suggestions. The conversation turned to the reality of what they were attempting. Dr. Chen didn't sugarcoat the situation. The bobcat's chances of survival were perhaps 30% at best, and that was with ideal treatment in a fully equipped facility. Out here, in a rancher's mudroom with improvised equipment, the odds dropped even further. But he also acknowledged that they'd already beaten the first and most critical hurdle by finding the animals when they did, and getting them to warmth before irreversible damage had occurred. As for the kittens, their prognosis was marginally better, but came with its own complications. If the mother didn't survive, hand-raising 6 newborn wild cats would be an enormous undertaking, requiring round-the-clock feeding every 2 to 3 hours and specialized care to prevent disease and developmental problems. Even if they all survived, the question of what to do with them long-term loomed large. Wildlife rehabilitation facilities were already stretched thin, and finding placement for 6 bobcat kittens, especially if they were mixed breed as Tom suspected, would be challenging. But those were problems for later. Right now, the focus was on the next 24 hours. Dr. Chen estimated he'd arrive at the ranch within 45 minutes, road conditions permitting, and would bring additional equipment and medications. In the meantime, Emily was to continue supportive care, monitor for any sudden changes, and prepare for the possibility of having to tube feed the mother if she didn't show signs of improvement soon. Tom excused himself to call the Game and Fish Department again, updating them on the situation and the veterinary involvement. The wildlife officer he spoke with seemed relieved that professionals were already on scene and confirmed that given the emergency circumstances, the temporary possession of the bobcat and kittens for medical treatment was legally justified. He'd file the appropriate paperwork and check in later in the day to assess the situation and discuss long-term plans. In the warm confines of the mudroom, the bobcat's breathing had begun to stabilize slightly, becoming more regular, if still shallow. Her eyes remained closed, but occasionally her ears would twitch in response to sounds, suggesting that consciousness wasn't as far away as it had been. The kittens had settled into a tight cluster against their mother's belly, their tiny bodies finally warm enough to stop shivering. The scene was almost peaceful, a stark contrast to the desperate struggle that had preceded it. Martha brought coffee for the adults and had started preparing what she called her crisis breakfast, a massive spread of eggs, bacon, toast, and hash browns that appeared whenever the family faced difficult situations. Food wouldn't solve their problems, but it would fuel the people trying to solve them, and that was practical help she could provide. The smell of cooking filled the house, mixing oddly with the medicinal scent of veterinary supplies and the wild musk of the bobcat. Ben finally accepted Martha's invitation to stay for breakfast, though he kept glancing at his watch, aware of his own animals waiting to be fed. But something about this situation held him here, a sense that he was witnessing something important, even if he couldn't quite articulate what it was. He'd lived his entire life around animals, had seen birth and death in all their forms, but this felt different somehow, more significant than the sum of its parts. Emily completed another round of vital checks, carefully documenting everything in a notebook she'd brought. The Bobcat's temperature had climbed to 94 degrees, a positive sign that her body was responding to the warming measures. Heart rate remained low, but had gained some regularity. These were small improvements, incremental victories in a battle that was far from won, but they were improvements nonetheless, and Emily allowed herself a cautious thread of hope. The sound of an engine in the driveway announced Dr. Chen's arrival earlier than expected, and Emily felt relief wash through her. As capable as she was, having her mentor's experience and additional resources would significantly improve their chances. Tom went to meet him, helping carry equipment inside while bringing Dr. Chen up to speed on everything that had happened since Emily's arrival. Dr. Michael Chen moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd spent 30 years responding to animal emergencies. His compact frame carrying a deceptive strength that came from decades of handling animals both domestic and wild. At 58, his black hair was streaked with distinguished silver, and his eyes held the kind of focused intelligence that missed nothing. He'd emigrated from Taiwan as a young veterinarian, drawn to Wyoming by its vast wild spaces and the challenge of working with species most urban practitioners would never encounter. He knelt beside the makeshift treatment area Emily had established, his experienced hands moving over the Bobcat with practiced assessment. His fingers detected what instruments couldn't always measure, the subtle changes in muscle tone and response that spoke volumes about an animal's condition. After several minutes of silent examination, he sat back on his heels and looked up at the assembled group with an expression that was difficult to read. The good news, he began in his precisely articulated English, was that the Bobcat's core temperature was continuing to rise, and her vital signs had stabilized somewhat in the past hour. The heat lamps and warming measures had prevented the downward spiral that claimed most hypothermia victims. Her heart, while still weak, was beating with more regularity, and her respirations had deepened slightly. These were all positive indicators that her body was fighting to recover. The concerning news, and Dr. Chen's expression grew more serious as he continued, was the severity of her malnutrition and the strain that pregnancy and birth had placed on her already depleted system. Blood work would take time to process, but based on physical examination alone, he estimated she was at least 3 to 4 weeks into severe starvation. Her body had been cannibalizing its own muscle mass to sustain the pregnancy, and the birth had pushed her to the absolute edge of what was survivable. Emily listened intently, occasionally jotting notes while Martha and Tom absorbed the information with the stoic acceptance of people accustomed to nature's harsh realities. Ben had quietly excused himself to tend to his own animals but promised to return later in the day. Dr. Chen continued his assessment, explaining that the immediate priority was nutritional support, but it had to be introduced carefully. A starving animal couldn't simply be given large amounts of food. The phenomenon known as refeeding syndrome could actually kill her if they weren't cautious. He'd brought specialized high-calorie veterinary nutrition in liquid form, designed for critical care cases. The plan was to begin with very small amounts administered through a feeding tube, gradually increasing over the next 48 hours as her body adjusted. He'd also brought antibiotics, concerned about the potential for infection, given her weakened immune system, and the trauma of giving birth in sub-zero temperatures. Each medication had to be carefully calculated based on her estimated weight, which Dr. Chen put at around 18 pounds, severely underweight for an adult female bobcat. While Dr. Chen and Emily prepared to place the feeding tube, Martha gently examined the kittens. her experienced hands checking each tiny body for signs of injury or abnormality. 5 of the 6 kittens appeared to be thriving, as well as could be expected under the circumstances. They were active, mewing regularly, and showed good muscle tone. But the 6th kitten, the smallest of the group with distinctive white markings on its chest and paws, was noticeably weaker than its siblings. "This little one," Martha said softly, holding up the smallest kitten for Dr. Chen to see, "seems to be struggling more than the others." The veterinarian took the tiny creature in his hands, his examination swift but thorough. The kitten was hypothermic despite the warming measures, its body temperature several degrees below its siblings, and its suckling reflex was weak. Dr. Chen's expression was grave as he explained that this kitten had likely been the last born and had received the least amount of initial care from their exhausted mother. The harsh reality was that in nature, the weakest offspring often didn't survive, particularly in litters born under extreme stress. The mother's body would naturally prioritize the stronger kittens who had the best chance of survival. But here, with human intervention, they had the ability to give this little one a chance it wouldn't have had otherwise. The question was whether that intervention was the right choice, a question that didn't have an easy answer. Tom surprised everyone by speaking up, his weathered hands reaching out to gently stroke the small kitten's head with one calloused finger. "That little fighter survived the worst night of winter," he said quietly. "Survived when by all rights none of them should have made it. Seems to me like it deserves a chance to keep fighting." Martha smiled at her husband, recognizing the soft heart he tried so hard to hide beneath his practical rancher's exterior. Dr. Chen nodded, accepting the decision without judgment. He prepared a separate warming area for the smallest kitten, using a heating pad set on low and carefully monitored to prevent overheating. He'd begin supplemental feeding immediately, using a tiny tube to ensure the kitten received nutrition even if its suckling reflex remained weak. It was intensive care on a miniature scale, but if the kitten could survive the next 24 hours, its chances would improve significantly. The procedure to place the feeding tube in the mother bobcat required careful coordination. Emily held the animal's head steady, while Dr. Chen worked with swift precision, inserting the narrow tube through her nostril and down into her stomach. The bobcat tensed but lacked the strength to resist, her eyes flickering open briefly to reveal golden irises clouded with exhaustion. The tube was secured in place with surgical tape, and Dr. Chen immediately began administering the first small amount of nutrition. The specialized formula was designed to be easily digestible, while providing maximum calories and nutrients in minimal volume. 20 milliliters to start, Dr. Chen explained as he carefully depressed the syringe plunger, watching for any signs of distress or rejection. The bobcat tolerated it well, her body seeming to recognize on some instinctive level that sustenance was being provided. In 4 hours, they'd give her another slightly larger dose, gradually building up her system's capacity to process food again. With the immediate medical interventions complete, the focus shifted to the kitten's feeding schedule. The milk replacer had arrived as promised, along with specialized bottles designed for orphaned wildlife. Dr. Chen showed Martha and Emily the proper technique, explaining that each kitten would need to be fed every 2 to 3 hours around the clock for the first week. It was a demanding schedule that would require multiple people taking shifts through the night. Martha immediately began organizing a rotation, her natural leadership skills coming to the fore. She'd take the early morning shift from 4 to 8. Emily would cover 8 to noon and return for the evening shift from 8 to midnight. Tom, despite his protest that he wasn't nurturing enough for such delicate work, was assigned the midnight to 4 shift. Dr. Chen promised to return twice daily to monitor the mother's condition and adjust treatment as needed. The first feeding session was a learning experience for everyone involved. Each kitten had to be held at the proper angle, the bottle nipple carefully positioned to prevent aspiration. The stronger kittens latched on eagerly, their tiny paws kneading against whoever held them in an instinctive nursing motion. The smallest kitten required tube feeding, a delicate procedure that Dr. Chen performed while explaining each step to Emily for future reference. As the morning progressed into afternoon, the mudroom had transformed into a full-scale wildlife intensive care unit. Charts tracked feeding times, amounts consumed, and elimination patterns. Temperature logs documented both the room's ambient temperature and the individual body temperatures of the Bobcat and her kittens. Medication schedules were posted on the wall, color-coded to prevent confusion. What had started as an emergency rescue had evolved into a comprehensive rehabilitation effort. Tom stood in the doorway, watching the organized chaos, marveling at how his simple rancher's life had been turned upside down in the span of a few hours. His cattle still needed tending, his regular chores still demanded attention, but somehow all of that seemed less important than the small family fighting for survival in his mudroom. Martha caught his eye and smiled, understanding without words what he was feeling. 35 years of marriage had taught them to communicate in glances and gestures as much as words. Dr. Chen prepared to leave, promising to return that evening for another assessment. He left detailed instructions, emergency contact numbers, and enough supplies to last through the next few days. As he packed his equipment, he took a moment to address the group seriously. What they were attempting was extraordinary, he told them, and the outcome was far from certain. But regardless of what happened, they'd already accomplished something remarkable by giving these animals a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. The first 48 hours were a blur of feeding schedules, temperature checks, and anxious monitoring. Tom discovered that midnight to 4 in the morning was simultaneously the longest and shortest shift, the house silent, except for the soft mewing of hungry kittens and the occasional creak of settling timbers. He'd never considered himself particularly nurturing, had left most of the hands-on care of their own children to Martha when they were infants. But something about these tiny creatures, depending entirely on his careful attention, brought out a tenderness he didn't know he possessed. The smallest kitten, whom Martha had taken to calling Hope, despite knowing they shouldn't name animals destined for release, remained the most challenging case. Each feeding required patient coaxing and careful tube placement, and her body temperature continued to fluctuate in ways that concerned everyone involved. Dr. Chen had warned them that her survival was far from guaranteed, that sometimes, despite best efforts, the weakest simply couldn't recover from such a traumatic start to life. But Hope seemed determined to prove him wrong. By the third day, her body temperature had stabilized, and she'd begun showing signs of a stronger suckling reflex. Emily celebrated this small victory with tears she wasn't embarrassed to shed, understanding that in wildlife rehabilitation, victories were often measured in incremental improvements rather than dramatic recoveries. Each feeding that Hope completed successfully was a triumph. Each gram of weight gained a reason for cautious optimism. The mother Bobcat, whom they'd simply been calling Mama, presented her own set of challenges and surprises. Her body temperature had returned to normal within the first 24 hours, and her vital signs had strengthened significantly. But she remained in a state of semi-consciousness for the first 3 days, her body's resources focused entirely on basic survival rather than awareness. Dr. Chen explained that this was actually protective, that full consciousness would increase her stress levels and potentially impair healing. On the fourth morning, everything changed. Tom was doing his regular check before heading out to tend his cattle when he noticed Mama's eyes were open and tracking his movements. Not with the glazed confusion of the past days, but with clear, focused awareness. He froze, maintaining eye contact while reaching slowly for the radio they'd been using to communicate between the house and barn. "Martha," he said quietly into the device, "you need to come to the mudroom right now." Martha arrived within minutes, Emily close behind her after receiving Martha's urgent phone call. The three of them stood at a respectful distance, watching as Mama's head lifted slightly, her nose twitching as she took in the sense of her surroundings. Her eyes moved to where her kittens slept in their warming box, and a low sound emerged from her throat, not quite a growl, but clearly a vocalization of concern and maternal anxiety. Dr. Chen arrived within the hour of Emily's call, and his examination confirmed what they'd all hoped to see. Mama's neurological responses were normal, her eyes clear and reactive. Her body temperature, heart rate, and respiration were all within acceptable ranges for a recovering animal. The feeding tube had been doing its work, and she'd gained back nearly 2 pounds, though she remained severely underweight. Most remarkably, when Dr. Chen gently palpated her abdomen, checking for signs of infection or internal injury, Mama's milk production had not only continued, but seemed to be increasing as her condition improved. The question now became whether to attempt reuniting Mama with her kittens. It was a decision that required careful consideration. In her weakened state and strange surroundings, there was risk that she might reject the kittens or, in confusion and stress, accidentally harm them. But keeping them separated went against every instinct of maternal bonding, and the kittens would benefit enormously from their mother's care if she was capable of providing it. Dr. Chen suggested a gradual reintroduction, starting with one of the stronger kittens to test Mama's response. They chose the largest kitten, a robust male with distinctive dark spots, who'd been nursing eagerly since the first feeding. Emily carefully placed the kitten near Mama's head, staying close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough to not interfere with natural bonding behavior. The moment was electric with tension as Mama's nose touched her baby for the first time in days. Her eyes widened slightly and her whole body seemed to come alive with purpose. She began licking the kitten with long, careful strokes, the grooming behavior immediate and instinctive. The kitten mewed and squirmed toward her warmth, and Mama carefully positioned herself to allow nursing access. Within minutes, the kitten had latched on and was feeding contentedly. Over the next hour, they carefully introduced each of the remaining kittens, saving hope for last. With each reunion, Mama's maternal behavior strengthened, her body language relaxing as her family was returned to her. When Hope was finally placed with her siblings, Mama's response was particularly tender, as if she recognized this one needed extra attention. She positioned Hope in the prime nursing spot and groomed her with special care. The transformation in the mudroom was remarkable. What had been a clinical treatment space became a den, with Mama arranging bedding materials with her paws and creating a protected space for her family. The kittens, responding to their mother's presence, seemed more settled and content than they had been under human care. It was a powerful reminder that despite all their medical knowledge and good intentions, they could never truly replace what a mother provided. But challenges remained. Mama's nutritional needs were enormous, both to continue her own recovery and to produce enough milk for 6 hungry kittens. Dr. Chen had transitioned her from tube feeding to offering food directly, starting with small amounts of easily digestible proteins. They'd begun with chicken broth fortified with supplements, gradually adding solid foods as her system adjusted. Tom had procured fresh rabbit and quail, knowing that familiar prey items might encourage her to eat more readily than domestic meats. The feeding strategy proved successful. Mama ate with cautious hunger, her instincts understanding that food meant survival for both herself and her babies. By the end of the first week, she was consuming 3 substantial meals per day, and her body condition was visibly improving. The sharp angles of her ribs were softening, her coat was regaining its luster, and her movements showed increasing strength and confidence. Emily had begun documenting the entire process with photographs and detailed notes, recognizing that this case was extraordinary enough to warrant publication in veterinary journals. With the family's permission, she'd also been sharing updates on social media, and the response had been overwhelming. Messages of support and offers of financial assistance poured in from around the country, with people moved by the story of the farmer who'd found the dying mother and her babies in the snow. The local news picked up the story, and soon reporters were requesting interviews and footage. Tom was reluctant at first, uncomfortable with attention and worried about disturbing Mama's recovery, but Martha convinced him that sharing the story could help educate people about wildlife conservation and the importance of coexisting with predators. They agreed to one carefully controlled interview session, with strict rules about maintaining distance and minimizing stress to the animals. The segment aired on the evening news, and the response was extraordinary. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in Sheridan called to offer support and resources. A wildlife conservation organization pledged funding to help cover medical costs and future care. Most surprisingly, a well-known wildlife photographer requested permission to document the family's recovery and eventual release, promising that any proceeds from published photos would go toward wildlife conservation efforts. As the second week began, a new routine had established itself in the Brennan household. The mudroom remained off-limits to everyone except the core care team, with strict protocols about hygiene and minimal disturbance. Mama had grown somewhat accustomed to human presence but maintained her wild wariness, a positive sign that she hadn't become too habituated to people. The kittens were thriving, their eyes beginning to open, revealing the brilliant blue that would eventually change to the golden yellow of their species. The transformation of the kittens over the following weeks was nothing short of miraculous. By the third week, all 6 had their eyes fully open, and their personalities were beginning to emerge in ways that fascinated everyone involved in their care. The largest male, whom Emily had nicknamed Scout, despite the no-naming rule, was bold and curious, often the first to explore new additions to their enclosure. 2 of the females were inseparable, always sleeping tangled together in a pile of spotted fur and tiny paws. Hope, the smallest kitten who'd fought so hard to survive, had developed into a spunky personality that belied her delicate size. She was often the instigator of play sessions, pouncing on her siblings with an enthusiasm that made Martha laugh every time she witnessed it. The fact that Hope had not only survived but was thriving felt like a personal victory for everyone who'd worked so tirelessly to save her life. The other 2 kittens, both males, showed the mixed heritage that Tom had suspected from the beginning. Their markings were less distinctly Bobcat, with longer tails and facial features that suggested domestic cat genetics somewhere in their lineage. Dr. Chen explained that this wasn't uncommon in areas where bobcat habitat overlapped with rural communities, though it did complicate questions about their eventual release into the wild. Mama's recovery had continued steadily, though the road back from near death was long and demanding. She'd regained most of her healthy weight, her coat now gleaming with the proper luster of a healthy predator. Her maternal instincts remained strong, but as the kittens grew more active and demanding, the strain was visible. Nursing 6 rapidly growing babies required enormous caloric intake, and even with the supplemental feeding Tom provided, she was working hard to keep up with their needs. Dr. Chen made the decision in the 4th week to begin supplementing the kittens' diet with solid food, easing the burden on Mama while teaching the babies crucial survival skills. He brought finely ground raw meat mixed with kitten formula, creating a paste that would transition them from purely liquid nutrition to the diet they'd need as they matured. The first introduction of solid food was messy and comical, with kittens getting more food on themselves than in their mouths, but within days they were eating eagerly. The question of what would happen to this unusual family loomed larger as the kittens grew stronger and more capable. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department had been remarkably supportive, understanding that the extraordinary circumstances warranted flexibility in their usual protocols. But they'd also been clear that long-term captivity wasn't an option. The animals would need to be released or placed in an appropriate facility, and that decision couldn't be postponed indefinitely. The complication was the mixed heritage of two of the kittens. Pure bobcats could potentially be released into suitable habitat after proper conditioning and preparation, but hybrids presented ethical and practical challenges. They might not have the full range of wild survival instincts, and introducing them into wild populations could impact genetic diversity in ways that conservation biologists worried about. Yet they were too wild to be adopted as pets, and few facilities had space or resources for animals caught between domestic and wild. Tom found himself growing attached, despite his best intentions, to maintain professional distance. He'd spent countless hours in the mudroom, watching Mama teach her babies the skills they'd need, observing their play that was actually practice for hunting and territorial behavior. He'd seen Hope pin down her larger brother with a move that was pure predator, all instinct and perfect technique. These weren't pets, would never be pets, but they'd become part of his life in a way he hadn't anticipated. Martha had always been more open about her emotional investment in the animals' welfare. She'd taken thousands of photographs, documenting every stage of their development, with the eye of someone who understood she was witnessing something special. Her favorite images were of Mama watching over her sleeping babies, the fierce maternal devotion visible in every line of her body. Those photos had become minor sensations on social media, with people across the country following the family's progress. Emily had contacted every wildlife rehabilitation facility within a 5-state radius, searching for options and advice. Most were sympathetic but lacked resources to take on such a large and complex case. One facility in Colorado expressed interest, but their director wanted to evaluate the animals in person before making commitments. A visit was scheduled for the 6th week, when the kittens would be old enough to handle the stress of examination by strangers. The wildlife photographer who'd requested access to document the family had proven to be a godsend in unexpected ways. His name was David Morrison, a man in his early 40s who'd spent 15 years capturing images of North American predators. His work had appeared in National Geographic and numerous other publications, and his respectful approach to wildlife photography had earned him access to situations that other photographers could only dream of. David's interest wasn't merely professional. He'd grown up on a ranch in Montana and understood the delicate balance between agricultural needs and wildlife conservation. His photographs of Mama and her kittens were stunning, capturing both their wildness and their vulnerability in ways that words couldn't express. But more than that, David had connections in the conservation community, and he'd been working behind the scenes to find solutions for the family's long-term future. It was David who connected them with the Rocky Mountain Wildlife Conservation Center, a facility that specialized in animals who couldn't be released, but could serve as ambassadors for their species. The center's director, Dr. Patricia Williams, had decades of experience with situations exactly like this one. After reviewing the case details and Emily's comprehensive documentation, she'd expressed cautious interest in potentially accepting the entire family. The possibility that they might stay together was enormous. Most scenarios they'd considered involved separating the kittens, with the purebreds going to one facility and the hybrids to another, or even euthanasia for the hybrids if no appropriate placement could be found. Mama would likely need to be released alone, her wild nature making her unsuitable for captivity. But Dr. Williams saw potential for something different, something that could benefit both the animals and public education about wildlife. Her proposal was innovative. The center would create a specialized habitat that mimicked natural bobcat territory, large enough to allow the family to engage in normal behaviors while still being observable for educational purposes. Mama could live out her life with her offspring, teaching them the skills they'd need even if they never used them in true wilderness. Visitors would see authentic predator behavior, learning about bobcat ecology and the challenges these animals faced in an increasingly human-dominated landscape. The financial aspect was daunting. Creating such a habitat would cost over $100,000, money the center didn't currently have. But Dr. Williams had submitted grant applications to several conservation foundations, and the public interest in the family's story had generated significant fundraising momentum. Corporate sponsors had reached out, moved by the narrative of human compassion meeting wild resilience. If everything came together, construction could begin within months. Tom and Martha discussed the proposal late into the night, weighing options and considering implications. Their mudroom couldn't be a permanent solution, and the kittens were growing rapidly, becoming more active and demanding more space. Within another month, the current setup would be inadequate. They needed to make decisions soon, but the weight of those decisions felt enormous. These animals' entire futures depended on choices that would be made in the coming weeks. Ben Crawford had become a regular visitor, stopping by most evenings to check on the family's progress. His quiet presence had been a steadying influence throughout the chaos, and his practical rancher's perspective helped ground some of the more emotional discussions. He'd also contributed financially to the care costs, refusing Tom's protests with the simple statement that some things were more important than money. The community had rallied in similar ways, with unexpected donations and offers of help arriving regularly. By the end of the 6th week, the kittens had grown into miniature versions of their mother, their spotted coats fully developed and their movements showing the grace and power that would only increase with maturity. They'd begun practicing stalking behaviors, crouching low and wiggling their hindquarters before pouncing on siblings or toys. Mama encouraged these behaviors, sometimes initiating play sessions that taught crucial hunting skills in the safe environment of their enclosure. The visit from Dr. Patricia Williams was scheduled for a crisp morning in early March, when the worst of winter had passed but spring hadn't yet established its full presence. Tom had spent the previous day ensuring everything was as clean and organized as possible. Wanting to present the best possible case for keeping the family together, Martha had prepared her usual crisis breakfast, though this time it was celebratory rather than emergency fuel, and Emily had compiled comprehensive medical records documenting every aspect of the animal's care and recovery. Dr. Williams arrived precisely on time, driving a well-worn SUV with Colorado plates and the Rocky Mountain Wildlife Conservation Center logo on its doors. She was a tall woman in her mid-50s with silver-streaked auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid, and eyes that held the kind of wisdom that came from decades of working with wild animals. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine, and her first question was about the animals rather than pleasantries or small talk. Tom led her to the mudroom, which had been expanded twice now to accommodate the growing family. What had started as a simple enclosed porch had evolved into a sophisticated temporary habitat, with climbing structures, hiding spots, and environmental enrichment that Emily had researched extensively. Dr. Williams paused at the doorway, taking in the scene before her, with the practiced eye of someone who'd evaluated countless animal situations. Mama was lounging on an elevated platform, her body relaxed but her attention focused on her kittens as they tumbled and played in the space below. The kittens themselves were engaged in an elaborate game that looked like chaos, but was actually carefully structured practice for adult behaviors. Scout was stalking one of the females, his body low to the ground in perfect hunting posture. Hope had climbed to the highest point she could reach, surveying her domain with the confidence of someone who'd overcome enormous odds to be there. Dr. Williams watched in silence for several minutes, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. Then she pulled out a tablet and began making notes, occasionally asking Emily questions about feeding schedules, health issues, behavioral observations, and the animal's responses to various stimuli. Her questions were detailed and technical, demonstrating a depth of knowledge that put everyone at ease. This was someone who understood wild animals at a fundamental level. After about 30 minutes of observation and discussion, Dr. Williams turned to the assembled group with an expression that was cautiously optimistic. What she'd seen exceeded her expectations, she told them. The kittens showed appropriate social behaviors and proper fear responses to unfamiliar humans. Mama had maintained her wild nature despite weeks of necessary human contact, which was crucial. The mixed-breed kittens, while obviously not purebred bobcats, didn't show the behavioral problems that sometimes arose in such crosses. Her preliminary assessment was that the entire family could potentially work as educational ambassadors at the conservation center. They'd require a specialized habitat that could accommodate both the need for public viewing and the animals' psychological welfare. The space would need to be large enough for natural behaviors, complex enough to provide mental stimulation, and designed in ways that minimized stress while maximizing educational value. Such a facility would be expensive to build and maintain, but the public interest in this family's story suggested it could become a flagship project for the center. The financial news was encouraging. Dr. Williams had received preliminary approval for a significant grant from a major wildlife conservation foundation, contingent on final review and project details. Additionally, several corporate sponsors had expressed interest in supporting the habitat construction. David Morrison's photographs had been published in a major magazine with an accompanying article, and the publication had pledged a substantial donation from article proceeds. The combination of funding sources meant that construction could potentially begin within 2 months. But Dr. Williams was also honest about the challenges they'd face. The kittens were approaching an age where their wild instincts would strengthen, potentially making them more difficult to manage. The current setup, while impressive for a temporary solution, wasn't adequate for long-term housing. They'd need to make decisions soon about next steps, and those decisions would impact the animals' welfare for the rest of their lives. If they moved forward with the conservation center plan, the family would need to be transported to Colorado within the next month. Tom felt his heart sink at the thought of the animals leaving, even though he'd known all along that this was temporary. Over the past weeks, checking on Mama and her babies had become part of his daily routine, something he looked forward to even during the busiest times of ranch work. He'd watch Hope play with her siblings and feel a surge of pride in her survival. He'd see Mama resting peacefully and remember the desperate creature he'd found in the snow, certain she'd die within hours. Martha's hand found his, squeezing gently in silent understanding. She'd grown attached too, had spent countless hours photographing and documenting the family's progress. Her social media posts about them had garnered thousands of followers, people who'd become invested in the survival story and checked daily for updates. Letting them go would be difficult, but keeping them here wasn't an option. They needed more than a converted mudroom, no matter how well equipped it had become. Emily was already thinking practically about the logistics of transport. The kittens would be old enough to handle the stress of moving by then, and Mama had proven to be resilient beyond anyone's expectations. Dr. Chen would need to do final health assessments, and they'd need to ensure all legal paperwork was in order. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department had been supportive throughout, but transferring wild animals across state lines required permits and documentation that couldn't be rushed. Dr. Williams spent another hour discussing specifics, outlining timelines and requirements, answering questions, and providing reassurance about the level of care the animals would receive. She showed them architectural drawings of the proposed habitat, a sprawling space that would include rock formations, trees, a small stream, and multiple den sites. It would be as close to natural habitat as possible, while still allowing for necessary management and public education. Viewing areas would be designed to minimize the animal's awareness of being observed, reducing stress while still providing visitors with meaningful encounters. Before leaving, Dr. Williams took a series of photographs and video clips, documentation she'd need for final grant applications and facility planning. She also spent time simply observing each kitten individually, noting their unique personalities and characteristics. This information would help in designing enrichment activities and managing their care once they arrived at the center. Her professionalism was evident in every interaction, but so was her genuine care for the animals' well-being. After Dr. Williams departed, the group gathered around Martha's kitchen table, processing everything they'd heard and considering next steps. The news was overwhelmingly positive, better than they dared hope when this journey had begun. The family would stay together, would live in a habitat that honored their wild nature, and would serve a purpose in educating the public about wildlife conservation. It was, by any measure, the best possible outcome. Yet there was sadness in the room, too. The bittersweet recognition that their time with these remarkable animals was drawing to a close. Tom excused himself after a few minutes, citing work that needed attention in the barn. But Martha knew he needed time alone to process his emotions. She found him an hour later standing in the mudroom doorway, watching Mama groom her kittens with patient thoroughness. "They're going to have a good life," Martha said softly, standing beside her husband. "Better than anything we could provide here long term." Tom nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he spoke. He'd never considered himself sentimental about animals, had spent his entire life raising livestock that would eventually go to market. But this was different somehow, perhaps because he'd witnessed the absolute depths of maternal devotion that night in the blizzard, had seen a starving mother choose death over abandoning her babies. The next few weeks were a flurry of preparation. Dr. Chen completed comprehensive health assessments on all 7 animals, declaring them fit for transport. Emily coordinated with Dr. Williams on logistics, arranging for a specialized animal transport service experienced in moving wild cats. Tom and Ben built a custom transport crate system that would keep the family together during the journey, while ensuring safety for both animals and handlers. Martha continued documenting everything, creating a final photo album that would go with the animals to their new home. The local community organized a farewell celebration, though it was carefully structured to avoid disturbing the animals. People who'd followed the story, contributed to care costs, or simply felt connected to the survival narrative gathered at the ranch. The mayor presented Tom with a community service award, recognizing his role in the rescue and rehabilitation. Emily gave a presentation about wildlife rehabilitation and the importance of coexisting with predators, using the Bobcat family story as a powerful example of what was possible when compassion met knowledge. The morning of the transport arrived with clear skies and moderate temperatures, perfect conditions for the 8-hour journey to Colorado. The specialized transport vehicle arrived at dawn, its climate-controlled interior and custom compartments designed specifically for moving wild cats safely. The driver, a weathered man named Carl, who'd been transporting wildlife for over 20 years, moved with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. He took time to inspect the custom crates Tom and Ben had built, nodding approvingly at their construction and attention to detail. Dr. Williams had driven up from Colorado the previous evening, wanting to personally oversee the transport and ensure everything went smoothly. She'd spent the night at a local motel, arriving at the ranch just after sunrise with coffee and nervous energy. This was, she'd admitted to Martha over breakfast, one of the most significant acquisitions her center had undertaken. The grant funding, corporate sponsorships, and public interest had elevated this project into something that could define the center's future direction. The process of moving the family into transport crates was carefully choreographed to minimize stress. Emily had been preparing the animals for this moment, introducing them to the crates gradually over the previous week, making them familiar spaces rather than frightening unknowns. Mama had been the most challenging, her wild instincts making her suspicious of confinement, but patient work and food rewards had eventually persuaded her to enter willingly. The kittens were easier, their youth making them adaptable and curious rather than fearful. Scout went first, exploring the crate with his characteristic boldness, before settling into the bedding that carried familiar scents from their enclosure. The others followed in succession, with Hope being last. Tom watched as the smallest kitten, the one who'd fought so hard to survive, walked confidently into her crate and curled up as if this was just another adventure in her young life. Martha had prepared care packages for the journey, detailed instructions about each animal's preferences and quirks, favorite toys and blankets that carried comforting scents. She'd also written a letter to the center's staff, thanking them in advance for caring for animals that had come to mean so much to her family. Her eyes were red from crying, though she'd tried to hide it behind sunglasses and busy activity. This was the right decision. She knew that intellectually, but her heart was struggling to accept the goodbye. Dr. Chen arrived to provide final health certificates required for interstate transport, examining each animal one last time. His assessment confirmed what everyone could see. They were healthy, well-adjusted, and ready for this next chapter. He'd become invested in their story too, making this case a priority, even when his practice's demands were overwhelming. His fee for services had been nominal, barely covering supplies, and he'd refused all attempts to pay him what his time was actually worth. As the crates were loaded into the transport vehicle, a small crowd gathered to witness the departure. Word had spread through the community, and people came to say goodbye to the animals who'd captured their hearts and imaginations. Some brought donations for the conservation center. Others simply wanted to be present for this moment. Ben stood beside Tom, neither man speaking, but their presence saying everything that needed to be said. David Morrison had positioned himself strategically to capture final photographs, his camera clicking softly as he documented the scene. His published work had helped fund this outcome, and he felt a responsibility to see it through to completion. The images would be used in educational materials, fundraising campaigns, and the center's promotional efforts. But beyond the professional considerations, David was moved by what he was witnessing. In 15 years of wildlife photography, he'd seen countless animal stories, but few had affected him like this one. Emily rode in the transport vehicle with Carl and Dr. Williams, unwilling to say goodbye until absolutely necessary. She'd been offered a position consulting for the Conservation Center on the Bobcat family's ongoing care, a role she'd accepted enthusiastically. It would mean regular trips to Colorado, opportunities to continue the relationship she'd built with these remarkable animals. The position also offered chances to work with other species, expanding her expertise beyond anything her current job provided. Tom and Martha watched the transport vehicle pull away, its precious cargo secured inside climate-controlled comfort. Tom's arm was around his wife's shoulders, holding her close as she finally let the tears flow freely. They'd done something extraordinary together, had saved 7 lives that would otherwise have been lost to the cruel mathematics of winter. The mudroom would seem empty without the sounds of kittens playing and Mama's soft vocalizations, but it would return to its original purpose, storing boots and coats and the ordinary items of ranch life. The drive to Colorado passed without incident, Carl's experienced handling keeping the journey smooth and stress-free. The animals settled quickly, their earlier conditioning paying off as they accepted the movement and unfamiliar sounds with minimal distress. Dr. Williams spent the trip on her phone and laptop, coordinating with her staff to ensure everything would be ready for the family's arrival. The habitat construction had been completed ahead of schedule, and the entire facility was prepared to welcome its newest residents. They arrived at the Conservation Center in late afternoon, the mountain setting providing a backdrop that seemed almost too perfect to be real. The habitat exceeded even the impressive architectural drawings Dr. Williams had shown them weeks earlier. Natural rock formations created multiple den sites, mature trees provided shade and climbing opportunities, and a flowing stream offered both drinking water and environmental enrichment. The space was enormous, nearly an acre in size, giving the family room to engage in natural behaviors while still being observable from carefully designed viewing areas. The release into the habitat was gradual and carefully managed. Mama's crate was opened first, allowing her to explore and claim the territory before her kittens joined her. She emerged cautiously, every sense alert, as she investigated this new domain. Her movements were pure wildcat, graceful and purposeful, showing no signs of the starving creature who'd nearly died in the snow. She checked den sites, marked boundaries, and eventually settled on a high rock outcropping that offered views of the entire habitat. Only after Mama had completed her initial exploration were the kittens released. They burst from their crates with youthful enthusiasm, immediately beginning to investigate every corner of their new home. Scout found the stream first, batting at the water with fascinated paws. Hope climbed to where Mama waited, seeking reassurance before venturing out on her own explorations. The other kittens scattered in different directions, their natural curiosity driving them to map this expansive new territory. Emily watched from the observation area, her professional assessment noting how well the animals adapted to the new space. But beneath the veterinary technician's analytical eye was the woman who'd spent countless hours feeding, medicating, and nurturing these babies. Seeing them now, healthy and vibrant in a habitat that honored their wild nature, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment, mixed with bittersweet loss. Dr. Williams stood beside her, equally moved by the scene unfolding. This was why she devoted her life to wildlife conservation, for moments when human intervention and wild resilience combined to create something beautiful. The bobcat family would become ambassadors for their species, teaching thousands of visitors about the importance of coexistence and conservation. Their story would inspire others to value wildlife, to understand that predators played crucial roles in healthy ecosystems. As the sun set over the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the bobcat family settled into their first evening in their permanent home. Mama had gathered her kittens into one of the den sites, grooming each one with the patient thoroughness that had helped them survive their desperate beginning. They were safe, they were together, and they had a future that honored both their wild heritage and their unique story. Back in Wyoming, Tom and Martha sat on their porch watching their own sunset, the ranch quiet around them. The mudroom had been cleaned and returned to its original purpose, all evidence of its temporary residence removed. But the memories remained, vivid and powerful, changing how they viewed the wild animals they shared the landscape with. Tomorrow would bring a return to normal routines, but nothing would ever be quite the same. They'd been part of something extraordinary, a story of survival and compassion that would stay with them forever. 1 year later, Tom and Martha made the drive to Colorado for what had become an annual pilgrimage, their truck loaded with supplies they'd brought for the conservation center and hearts full of anticipation about seeing the bobcat family again. The journey had become something they looked forward to, a chance to witness the ongoing impact of that desperate rescue on a winter morning that now felt like both yesterday and a lifetime ago. The Rocky Mountain Wildlife Conservation Center had transformed in the 12 months since the bobcat family's arrival. The habitat that housed Mama and her kittens had become the facility's most popular attraction, drawing visitors from across the country who'd followed the survival story through media coverage and social media updates. The viewing areas were carefully designed to allow observation without disturbing the animals, and educational displays told the complete narrative from rescue through rehabilitation to their current role as ambassadors for their species. Dr. Williams greeted Tom and Martha warmly, her enthusiasm for the project evident in every word, as she updated them on the past year's developments. The family had adapted beautifully to their home, she explained, showing natural behaviors that captivated visitors and provided invaluable educational opportunities. Mama had established clear territory within the habitat, teaching her growing offspring the skills they'd need even though they'd never use them for true survival. The kittens, now nearly full-grown, had developed into magnificent examples of their species. The financial success had exceeded even optimistic projections. Visitor numbers had increased by 40% since the family's arrival, with people specifically requesting to see the Bobcats whose story had touched hearts worldwide. Merchandise featuring their images sold consistently, with proceeds funding additional conservation programs. Corporate sponsors had renewed their commitments, and new grant funding had allowed the center to expand its educational programming significantly. But beyond the numbers and success metrics, Dr. Williams explained, the real impact was in changed perceptions. Visitors who arrived viewing predators as threats left understanding their crucial role in ecosystem health. Children who met the Bobcat family through educational programs developed conservation ethics that would influence their choices for decades. The story had become a teaching tool, demonstrating the intersection of human compassion and wildlife needs in ways that resonated across demographic boundaries. Emily had made good on her consulting arrangement, visiting Colorado monthly to monitor the family's health and contribute to program development. She'd also begun pursuing advanced certification in wildlife medicine, her career trajectory forever altered by those intense weeks of caring for starving kittens and their dying mother. The experience had shown her what was possible when dedication met opportunity, and she'd become passionate about expanding wildlife rehabilitation resources in rural communities. As Tom and Martha approached the Bobcat habitat, they could see Mama lounging on her favorite rock outcropping, the same commanding position she'd claimed on that first day. She was magnificent in her prime, her coat glossy, and her body radiating the health and confidence of a successful predator. The near-death experience of that winter night seemed impossible when looking at her now, though Tom would never forget the desperate creature he'd found in the snow. The kittens, now technically adolescents approaching their full adult size, were scattered throughout the habitat, engaged in various activities. Scout, true to his name, was investigating a new enrichment feature the staff had added, his bold curiosity unchanged from his earliest days. Hope, no longer the smallest but still distinctively marked, was practicing hunting techniques on a mechanical lure, her movements showing the perfect blend of instinct and learned behavior. A small crowd had gathered at the viewing area, families with children pressing close to the glass for better views, adults reading the educational displays that told the family's story. Tom overheard fragments of conversations, people moved by the narrative of survival and rescue, children asking thoughtful questions about why bobcats mattered and how humans could help wildlife. This was the legacy of that blizzard morning, understanding spreading through countless individual connections. Dr. Williams had arranged a special behind-the-scenes tour, allowing Tom and Martha access to areas not open to general visitors. They watched from a protected observation post as staff conducted a training session with Mama, using positive reinforcement to teach behaviors that would facilitate future medical care. The Bobcat's intelligence was evident in her quick learning, and her trust in specific staff members showed in her willing participation. The tour included meeting other residents of the Conservation Center, animals with their own rescue stories and roles in education. A golden eagle with a permanently damaged wing soared in a large aviary, teaching visitors about raptor conservation. A pair of river otters demonstrated the importance of clean waterways through their playful behavior. Each animal had a story, but the Bobcat family remained the center's flagship residents, their narrative resonating in ways that transcended typical wildlife education. Over lunch in the center's cafe, Dr. Williams shared plans for the future. The success of the Bobcat program had inspired proposals for additional predator habitats, facilities that could house animals rescued under similar circumstances while serving educational missions. Grant applications were pending, and the community support suggested expansion was not only possible but likely. The legacy of one farmer's compassionate decision was rippling outward in ways none of them had imagined. David Morrison joined them, his latest photography book prominently displayed in the center's gift shop. The publication featured the Bobcat family extensively, with proceeds supporting wildlife conservation initiatives. He'd continued documenting their development, creating a visual archive that would have value for both education and scientific research. His images had won awards, but more importantly, they'd helped shift public perception of predators from threats to valued ecosystem members. As the day drew to a close and Tom and Martha prepared for the drive home, they took one final walk past the bobcat habitat. The family was settling in for the evening, Mama grooming her nearly grown kittens with the same patient thoroughness she'd shown since their birth. The scene was peaceful, a stark contrast to the desperate struggle in the snow that had brought them all to this moment. Tom thought about that morning, about the decision to investigate a dark shape in the snow rather than dismissing it as irrelevant to his ranching concerns. Such a small choice, really, taking a few minutes to check on something unusual. Yet that choice had cascaded into saved lives, changed careers, expanded educational programs, and shifted conservation funding. It had connected their small Wyoming ranch to a broader narrative about coexistence and compassion. The drive home was quiet, both Tom and Martha lost in reflection. The ranch would never have resident bobcats again, would return to being solely an agricultural operation. But the experience had fundamentally changed how they viewed the wildlife they shared the landscape with, had deepened their understanding of the interconnected nature of all life. They'd learned that wild animals weren't so different from domestic ones in their fundamental needs and their capacity for resilience when given a chance. Back home, the mudroom stood empty of exotic residents, filled instead with the ordinary items of ranch life. But sometimes, when Tom passed through late at night checking on things before bed, he'd pause and remember the tiny mewing sounds of newborn kittens, the fierce determination in a starving mother's eyes, the feel of Hope's tiny body warming in his hands. Those memories had become part of the ranch's story, woven into its history as surely as any family anecdote. The Bobcat family's story continued to spread, shared through articles, social media posts, educational programs, and word of mouth. It became a parable about the impact of individual choices, about the importance of paying attention to the world around us, about the remarkable things that could happen when compassion met knowledge and resources. Thousands of people who would never visit the conservation center knew about the starving pregnant bobcat who'd shielded her 6 freezing kittens through a blizzard, and the farmer whose sunrise discovery had saved them all. And on a rock outcropping in Colorado, Mama rested with her family, safe and cared for, her story inspiring a new generation to value wildlife and work toward a world where humans and predators could coexist with mutual benefit. She would never know how many lives she'd touched, how many hearts she'd changed, or how her desperate fight for survival had become a beacon of hope. But her legacy lived on, rippling outward in ways that would continue long after her lifetime, a testament to the extraordinary power of one mother's love and one human's compassion.